Okay. Well, okay. And again, one final reminder, remember the exam time you have on Friday is 10 to 11:50, even though our normal class starting time is 11. So you want to keep that in mind, so you're not cutting yourself short on time. And if you need to get a Scantron, you want to make sure to do that. Well, one way of portraying the progression from Descartes, who really defends our certain knowledge of all kinds of things in philosophy, right? Because he gets back our common sense knowledge of the world, our knowledge of arithmetic, our knowledge of God, our knowledge of self. But one way of looking at it is as a progression towards more and more skeptical views when you go through Locke, Berkeley, and Hume. And what produces the skepticism, the one factor that is responsible for it more than anything else is this view that began with Descartes that we call the egocentric predicament. That somehow the part of us that is aware of what's going on around it, the mind, what Locke calls the understanding, is in the middle, and the only thing the mind is immediately acquainted with, the only thing the mind immediately perceives is its own sensations and or ideas. This was sometimes called the theory of ideas. It's that view that really leads to skepticism. As Thomas Reid put it, who was a contemporary of Hume's and argued against Hume's skepticism, is that ideas were first introduced into philosophy to explain how we perceive the world, but then they progressively took over to where later philosophers, ending with Hume, realized that if we start with the claim that what the mind is immediately acquainted with is only its own inner mental life, its own ideas, we ultimately end up not being able to defend anything but those ideas. And this is where Hume has ended up. He says we ought to be skeptical about the claim that we can defend the existence of a material world. For Hume, he calls Locke's ideas perceptions, divides them into impressions and ideas. But Hume says, since the mind is acquainted only with its own perceptions, you can't get beyond them to the claim that anything exists besides the perceptions. You can't say that those perceptions that we seem to have that seem to be caused by real material objects in the world are really caused by them. If you can never get beyond the perceptions, you can't defend the claim that they're caused by real material objects. Berkeley pointed this out, and Hume doesn't say there is no material world. He says we don't have any rational way to defend the claim that there is one. So we ought to be skeptical about it. A skeptic says, suspend your belief. Say, well, maybe there is, maybe there isn't, but I can't know for sure which is true. Hume says we can not equally defend the existence of a continuous self. And his whole skeptical method is built around this distinction he gives us between impressions and ideas. Hume is an empiricist. Empiricists say if you make any knowledge claims, they ought to be based on something that you perceive. Well, the classes of our perceptions Hume divides into two. There's the immediate experience we have when we perceive something in the external world. He calls these impressions. And we can have copies of these impressions. In other words, if I look at the blackboard over there, my direct experience of the blackboard would be something Hume would describe as having an impression of the blackboard. But then if I looked away and tried to remember it, or tried to imagine a blackboard that looked like it, that's colored green, these copies we have of our original sense experience in the memory and the imagination Hume calls ideas. For Locke, everything is an idea. For Hume, only the copies of impressions are ideas. But basically, Hume uses the word perceptions for all of the immediate objects of experience, and this is what Locke uses the word idea for. So our immediate impressions are much more lively and vivid, Hume says, than the copies, the faint copies of them we have in our memory and our imagination. Well, what Hume says is the question we should ask if we suspect that a philosopher is using a word that we have want to raise a skeptical doubt about, like material substance, soul, self, necessary connection, and cause and effect. If we think a philosopher is using a word that we want to be skeptical about, what we ought to say is, well, show me the impression that the idea attached to that word is derived from. And there's his empiricism. In other words, we ought to be able to trace back to experience what we make philosophical claims to have knowledge of. And Hume says if you can do that, then you might have the knowledge you claim. But he says if you don't, then you can't defend the concept that you're saying we have knowledge of. You can't defend it rationally because you can't trace anything back to experience. And also he says, well, you know what? You may also have a word you're using that has no clear meaning because you can't trace it back to an impression. We know what we mean by a word like yellow because we can trace the idea we have of yellow back to an experience of yellow, an impression. But Hume is going to try to say we can't trace words like material substance back to an impression. We can't trace words like self or soul or immaterial substance back to an impression. And so, not only can't we defend the existence of a continuous self, he's going to claim, but we may not even have a clear idea of what we mean when we use the word. So, the question we should raise then, the skeptical question, is, from what impression is that supposed idea derived? And if you can't trace your idea back to an impression, Hume says you should be skeptical about what you're talking about and not claim knowledge. So the significance of this question for the self or soul is, if we cannot trace the word self or soul or immaterial substance back to an impression, then Hume would say you don't have any clear idea of what you mean when you're using the word. So Hume says, well, and again, Hume is going to try to tell us we should not only be skeptical about the existence of an eternal soul that will go and live on past the death of the body, but Hume says we ought to be skeptical about the claim that we're a continuous self. We assume we are, right? You think you're the same person who sat in here Monday in class. All of you to get into college had to have either a GED or a high school diploma, right? You say, well, wait a second, I'm the same person now who got that high school diploma last year or 2 years ago or whenever that was. So that should be considered to be my high school diploma. And I got my high school diploma back in the dark ages. Way too long. Yes, we had high school diplomas back then. We had high schools back then. Got it from Poly. I was a Poly boy. Back then, there were only Poly boys, so they didn't go co-ed for a couple of years after I got out of there. Anyway, but the point is, in saying that we should be given credit for that, we're saying, well, hey, I'm the same self as the self who got that diploma, so that's my diploma, But Hume says you can't defend that claim philosophically. Now, Hume says, like anybody else, I have to act in my everyday life as if I'm in a real world of material objects where causes and effects occur and are predictable, where I'm encountering other people in the world. And I have to presuppose, says Hume, that I'm the same person, who wrote the famous works in philosophy that I wrote. But Hume says when I come to defend that claim philosophically, I can't do it. And so, philosophically, I ought to be skeptical about it. So Hume makes a distinction between how he has to live in his everyday life and what he thinks he can defend philosophically. There's this famous passage where Hume says, I can be up there in my room writing all this skeptical stuff. But he says, then I put it down, I go downstairs, I meet friends of mine. He says, I dine, I play a game of backgammon. And Hume's day backgammon was really big. If you tour Monticello, you find a replica of a backgammon set that Thomas Jefferson used to use. There are even recordings in Jefferson's journal about the times when he lost money playing backgammon. I guess he wasn't very good at it. But the point is, Hume says, then I come back up and I look at all this skeptical philosophy, and it seems very distant and cold to me. But he says, nonetheless, that's where reason takes me as a philosopher, being skeptical about all this stuff. So how does Hume try to say that we can't defend the claim that we're a continuous self or soul? Well, he says, well, how would I find evidence of that if not by introspection? Remember, Locke said we have ideas from sensation, from what we perceive going on around us, and also from reflection, from what we gain by introspection into kind of looking on into what and reflecting on what goes on in our own minds. So Hume says, well, what do I get when I look for an idea of the self? He says, our self is supposed to remain continuously the same throughout our lives and have an identity from one moment of time to the next. So he says, when I actually look into to my own mind, do I find such a self? And so he says, an impression that gives rise to the idea of self should be one that continues the same throughout our lives, since the self is supposed to continue the same. In other words, there is a real sense in which I think I'm the same person, who was born at such and such a time, and that the baby pictures, that my parents had of me are in some sense of the same person who's before you now, right? So self is supposed to continue the same throughout our lives. So Hume says, do I find such an impression? Can such an idea of the self be found to be based on a real impression we get by introspection? Well, what does Hume find when he enters by introspection into what he calls his self or soul? Does he perceive something simple and continuously the same? And the answer is no. He says, when I look into what I call myself, all I find are these discrete perceptions of light and cold, heat and shade. In other words, these unattached perceptions, what Locke would have called simple ideas, but he says, I don't find the self. So he says, the only thing I can claim that I can defend philosophically about the self is that it's a bundle of continuously variable, continuously changing impressions. He likens the mind to a theater on which these impressions come and go. He says with inconceivable rapidity, but he says I don't have an impression of a continuous self. So he says what that amounts to is that I can't claim to have an idea of the self that I can defend philosophically that's based on a previous impression. So he says, well, what of the idea we do think we have of the self as a continuous entity? Well, basically, Hume says by our human nature, we tend to manufacture a continuous self as a fiction that ties all these discrete, fleeting impressions together and relates them to one and the same self. But he says that self is just a fiction produced by the mind and not one we can defend the existence of philosophically. So that's basically where Hume goes. So he says the only thing we can defend philosophically is that we're a bundle of perceptions. The identity we describe to the mind then for Hume is fictitious based on tying them together. And this is the strategy he uses with a lot of things that philosophers claim we have knowledge of. He says, look, if the mind knows only its own perceptions, how can I get beyond those to the claim that those perceptions are caused by real material objects beyond them? He says, I have no impression of matter as a substance that supports the perceivable qualities I have. So I can't get beyond them to the claim that a material thing exists. What about cause and effect? I'm not going to ask you questions about that because I didn't go into that portion of the PowerPoint. But Hume says all I can see is that causes precede their effects in time, and causes are next to their effects in space, related to their effects in space. That is, the cue ball has to roll into the 8 ball to get the 8 ball to move. But Hume says, look at that instance of the cue ball rolling into the 8 ball as closely as you can, and you will never find a necessary connection between a cause and its effect. But if there is no perceivable necessary connection, then I cannot say on the basis of that the future will resemble the past, and that laws of cause and effect that have worked up to now are going to continue to work in the future. So I can't defend the claim that there are regular laws of nature. So Hume, generates a lot of skeptical arguments from this one principle that we ought to be able to defend what we think we have knowledge of by tracing back our ideas to preceding impressions. Now, the example I gave you of the astronauts, the Soviet cosmonauts going up in space and trying to defend the line, this is when I was in elementary school, the atheistic line of the Soviet Union by saying, here I am in the heavens, I'm looking out my space capsule window, I don't see a God, there must not be a God. Well, you can say, is that how you prove or disprove God anyway? Or are you looking in the wrong place? And basically, philosophers after Hume, like Immanuel Kant, said the same thing about Hume's arguments on the self. Is that where you ought to be looking anyway? The self, says Kant, is the part of us that has the perceptions, but you don't find the self in the perceptions. It's what has them, it's not in them, and so you can't raise skeptical arguments about the existence of the self just by noting that we don't find the self in our perceptions when we introspect, like Hume claims we have. And Kant says the same thing goes for other things, like whether there's a material world. So there are various ways that philosophers tried to answer Hume's skepticism, but I just want you to know a little bit about what he believe. We don't have much time. Are there any specific questions about utilitarianism? I forget whether I went over part of this review sheet on utilitarianism with you all. Like I say, the PowerPoint, the integrity file from last time somehow never made it there. But basically, just to reiterate a few points, consequentialist theories say consequences are all important. They're the only factors to consider when looking at the moral rightness or wrongness of an action. And utilitarian consequentialism says we ought to look at the consequences of what we do for all concerned. The consequences for me matter, as Bentham put it, each to count as one but none for more than one. But the consequences for me of what I do don't matter any more than the consequences for you if you're also affected by what I do. Now, don't worry about the difference between consequentialist and non-consequentialist theories. We haven't had time to fit in a non-consequentialist view. And don't worry about the act rule utilitarianism distinction. I cover that, even though it's in the PowerPoint. I almost never cover it in Philosophy 101, either here or in Ethics. If I do a specific ethics course, I usually go over it. But that gets a little more detailed than I want to get into at the Philosophy 101 level. But basically, for Bentham, they both adopted hedonism, Bentham and Mill, which is the view that there's only one standard of value. In other words, they're trying to define moral value, what's good morally, in terms of some non-moral property, and for them it's pleasure or happiness. So we're defining moral value in terms of what promotes pleasure or happiness or lessens pain and unhappiness. And that's the way a hedonist looks at things. Only the utilitarians said the happiness or pleasure we want to worry about is the happiness or pleasure for all those affected by our actions, or if it's a policy decision that affects the whole society, like Obamacare or something like that, then you're talking about the happiness or unhappiness of the society as a whole. And so basically, for Bentham, the only thing that mattered for pleasures is their quantity. They're all the same if their quantity is the same. This got him into trouble because critics were saying, well, if you, Bentham, are saying that the pig out there in the field, if he gets as much pleasure from eating slop as I do from going and spending an afternoon at the symphony, then all pleasures are on a par. So what's the difference between human beings and the pig out there in the field? Aren't you, Bentham, in claiming that all pleasures are on a par, giving us a very low view of human beings as just creatures of pain and pleasure? And so utilitarianism was literally criticized as being a pig morality. And so for Bentham, quality is the only thing that matters. For John Stuart Mill, he tries to defend utilitarianism against those criticisms by saying no. Look, none of us is going to want to trade places with a pig in the field even if we were guaranteed the full allowance of the kinds of pleasures a pig can enjoy. Why? Because there are things we can appreciate as a human being that the pig out there in the field knows nothing of. None of us is going to trade places with the pig. Mill says we really do have a theory that can account for a difference between us and non-human animals, because there are higher pleasures, the pleasures of the intellect and the imagination, that the pig knows nothing of, but that we can appreciate as human beings. So Mill tries to introduce qualitative differences in pleasures, but this is problematic for his hedonism, because hedonism says there's only one value: pleasure or happiness. But if you're saying that it's better to have a lower quantity of happiness, but have that happiness be produced by a higher pleasure, like discussing philosophy, better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool or pig satisfied, then you're saying whatever is of value in these higher pleasures, it's not just the quantity of pleasure. Well, this effectively abandons hedonism, because you're saying that there's some other aspect of higher pleasures that makes them valuable that can't boil down to just happiness or pleasure. So you're sneaking some other standard in there. So this abandons hedonism, because hedonism says that the only thing with intrinsic value is pleasure. Most modern utilitarians are pluralists. They say there are other things of value in and of themselves: knowledge, satisfaction of our own preferences, self-realization, that maintain that there are other things of value. So you do not have to be a hedonist to be a utilitarian. You can be a pluralist and recognize many standards of pleasure. And most modern utilitarians are like Jonathan Glover. Some utilitarians aren't. They're old-fashioned Benthamite utilitarians who just hold to hedonism. For Bentham, the pleasures and pains of animals mean they should be included in the moral sphere. And contemporary Benthamite utilitarians like Peter Singer, who you saw in the video, are often animal rights activists saying, well, we agree with Bentham that the question to ask when deciding whether animals, non-human animals, have rights is not, can they reason, like Aristotle or Kant would have asked. We haven't talked about Kant. Or can they talk? Some people have said the difference between us and non-human animals is we're language users, they're not. But Bentham says no, the only question to ask is, can they suffer? And if they can suffer, if they can feel pain and pleasure, then we have direct moral duties to non-human animals. Not everybody agrees with him on this, but it has been a position that has been looked upon very favorably by animal rights activists as a way of, talking about our, including animals in the moral sphere. Okay, well that's all I'm going to do in hitting some of the highlights of utilitarianism. Bring a number 2 pencil. That's the one way to guarantee you'll have a good one to use. Buy your Scantron if you don't already have it. We'll see you at 10 o'clock in the morning on Friday, right? So take care. And if you still need a copy of any of the sheets I passed out, let me know.